Hey guys, Frenzy the Killbot here. I think it's time that we learn a little bit more about humanity in the Halo universe. And what about the Master Chief himself? For the series protagonist, we know very little about him other than the fact that he kills aliens and isn't afraid of anything. The Halo games, the majority of them at least, take place in the year 2552. So what supposedly happens in the next half millennium or so to get us from here to there? Although, before I get too far into it, I'd like to point out that I'm simplifying and streamlining a lot of this. Extended universe canon for any fandom is notoriously messy, and Halo is no exception. So right around now, in the early 21st century, humanity expanded their spacefaring technologies, including the construction of orbital space stations and space elevators. By the end of the century, colonies had been established on the Moon, Mars, and several of Jupiter's moons. Over the next century, the size and scope of these colonies would increase and the space technologies would mature. Unfortunately, time is cyclical and humans are humans, and so also in that time several ideological factions would rise to prominence, and by the 2160s the solar system would devolve into what was known as the Interplanetary War. The United Nations brought together the countries that were unaligned with any of the splinter factions to create a sort of Earth-based status quo faction. They consolidated their military and space assets and founded the United Nations Space Command, the UNSC, to fight on their behalf. After almost a decade of war with battles on Earth and in every colony, the UN faction would prove to be the victor. As part of the war-ending treaty, the UN actually dissolved all nations and other governing factions, and by 2204 had created and legitimized the Unified Earth Government, the UEG, as a formal executive, legislative, and judicial body for all humankind. The UNSC would act as the UEG's military arm, including taking responsibility for exploration, colonization, and other large-scale scientific endeavors. Optimistically, the result was the entirety of humanity united under one banner. Pessimistically, and maybe more realistically, it was a threat against any colony seeking independence, and with the muscle to back it up. The 23rd century was a time of peace for the UEG, but even with their colonies in the Sol system, overpopulation and dwindling resources became a problem. But in 2291, Doctors Wallace Fujikawa and Tobias Fleming Shaw invented the Shaw-Fujikawa Translight Engine, or slipspace engine, allowing faster-than-light travel and the ability for humanity to escape our solar system. The UEG leaned hard into exploration and colonization, preferring habitable Earth-like planets but willing to terraform planets or moons where the available resources were worth the effort. 100 years later, by 2390, about 200 colonies had been established. Close enough to be easily accessible by slipspace travel, these would come to be known as the inner colonies. By the 25th century, the human empire had expanded to over 800 colonies, most of which were considered the outer colonies, some as far as 100 light-years away. Many of these outer colonies were specifically established for agriculture or resource extraction, and being so far from Earth, it's easy to see how they would feel some combination of unrepresented, ignored, and exploited. Essentially, they were kinda like the districts in the Hunger Games books, devoted to one industry and with the implicit threat of the UNSC looming should they stop being useful. Towards the end of the century, many secessionist groups had formed, arguing for greater independence from the Earth-centric government. But any protest or demonstration was quickly and often violently put down by the UNSC. This had the obvious effect of further alienating and radicalizing the population of the outer colonies, and by the year 2494, the UNSC was dealing with a civil war on multiple fronts, collectively known as the Insurrection. If I've been making the UEG and UNSC sound like an evil empire, that's because, well, it's not that far from the truth. They're pretty obviously and unashamedly authoritarian. It's actually one of the things I like about the Halo canon. Not because it's edgy or anything, it's just very nakedly human, warts and all as they say. And it makes for an interesting comparison against the eventual Covenant enemy. I did mention at the very start of the Halo 1 LP, but the booklet that came with that game states that the war started when aliens abruptly appeared at the planet Harvest in the year 2525 and almost entirely wiped out the human fleet there. I wonder how many people ever questioned why there even was a fleet of warships there in the first place. I sure didn't. The emergence of the Covenant threat pretty much stopped the insurrection dead in its tracks, of course. Nothing like genocidal aliens destroying entire planets to give you some perspective. But it should be kept in mind that basically all of the UNSC's might, including the Spartan 1 and 2 super soldiers, were created to fight against other humans, not aliens. So speaking of super soldiers, on to the Master Chief himself, John 117. Where did he come from? If you watched my first interstitial video, I spent some time talking about the Orion Project and the Spartan 1s. This program involved giving volunteer soldiers genetic therapies and relatively small-scale physical augmentations to increase their speed and strength. In some cases, like our very own Sergeant Johnson, the treatments were successful and effective. However, the benefits weren't impressive enough to justify the costs or the casualties in the cases where the treatments failed. Seems pretty straightforward and reasonable, right? Well, the Spartan 2 program took a drastically different approach, and I'm going to warn you now, it's not pretty. What if you ignored everything about ethics, morality, or legality, and just did whatever it took to make the absolute best, most effective soldiers? This was basically the pitch that Dr. Catherine Halsey gave to the heads of the Office of Naval Intelligence's Section 3, their top secret research and development division. She claimed that if they gave her a blank check and the free rein to do whatever she felt necessary, she could deliver them a team of the greatest soldiers humanity had ever seen. These soldiers could be used to make surgical strikes on the insurrectionists' leadership, quickly bringing their rebellion to an end and saving millions of lives. Surely this end would justify any means. Dr. Halsey had a reputation for being incredibly intelligent, and the insurrection was getting messy, so her proposal was given the green light. Using DNA harvested from a UEG vaccination program, Dr. Halsey identified probable candidates based on specific genetic markers for things such as athletic and intellectual potential. It took several years of analysis, but by the year 2517, she had identified the most promising 75 candidates in all of human-controlled space. I should mention at this point, when I say candidates, I'm talking about 5- and 6-year-old children. Yes, one of the ways that Dr. Halsey had identified to create better soldiers was to start training them from a very young age. Once the children had been identified, they were kidnapped by UNSC Spec Ops teams and replaced with clones. The process to clone a human, as well as the growth acceleration and neural mapping processes needed for the project, were all imperfect and highly illegal. But the clones didn't have to be particularly convincing replacements, as within weeks they would develop major mental and physical health issues, and almost all of them would be dead within months, tying up the loose ends. The kidnapped children, now conscripted recruits, were allowed to keep their first names, but were stripped of their family names and given a number designation instead. The recruits were initially treated quite harshly, like full-grown adults in basic training. Stun batons were used to ensure obedience, and food was withheld for poor performance. The children trained all day, every day for years, not just in strategy, tactics, and combat skills, but in math, science, and history as well. Dr. Halsey was not wrong about their potential. By the time they were 12 years old, they had the equivalent of a university education and were perfectly obedient soldiers, being pitted against a full company of experienced Marines in war games, and usually winning. However, this would prove to be the easy part of the program. At the age of 14, the Spartans were scheduled to undergo their augmentations. As well as similar genetic therapies to what the Spartan 1 volunteers received, the Spartan 2s underwent a number of intensive surgical procedures for things like increasing the blood flow in the capillaries of their retinas, bonding a carbide ceramic to their skeletal structure, and injecting time-released growth hormones directly into their thyroid glands and major muscle groups. Many of these procedures were entirely untested on humans, and having them done in such a short time frame led to a poor survival rate. The augmentations were only successful for 33 of the 75 candidates. Another 30 of them died during the procedures, and the remaining 12 either rejected the augmentations or were rendered too disabled or disfigured to continue the program. For the surviving Spartans, however, the results were amazing. As a test, 3 orbital drop shock troopers were ordered to pick a fight with John 117. Trained to neutralize threats and unused to his new strength and speed, John ended up killing 2 of them and crippled the 3rd before being ordered to stand down. Trainers working on the program began having to wear powered exosuits like Ripley and Aliens to avoid being injured during exercises. With the emergence of the Covenant threat, the Spartans would be rushed into the 3rd and final phase of the program, the union of the Spartan program with another top-secret R&D program, Project Mjolnir. Mjolnir is of course the iconic green power armor that makes the Spartan so instantly recognizable. The main feature of the Mjolnir armor is actually its ability to amplify the user's movements, further increasing strength and speed. Designed specifically for the Spartan's heightened muscle and bone density, a normal human couldn't even use the suit without being injured. The armor also has all the things you'd expect out of futuristic power armor. Personal air supply, heads-up display, ballistic protection, biomedical monitoring. But the original armor didn't have the energy shields. That's actually something that the humans reverse-engineered from the Covenant elites and incorporated in a later revision. After entering active service, the Spartans were kept secret. However, after a couple decades of war, their existence was publicized to boost morale in the UNSC and the rest of humanity. Their appearance is formidable, and the opaque helmets on top of the rigid professionalism instilled by their harsh training gives the impression that they are entirely expressionless, robotic, or even inhuman. Other soldiers in the UNSC tend to see them as almost mythological creatures rather than fellow service members. It doesn't come up in the games very often, but there were also Spartan 3 super soldiers around at the time that Halo starts. They were actually the first created specifically to counter the Covenant. The Spartan 3s were sort of intended to be cheaper knockoffs of the Spartan 2s, the idea being something like getting soldiers with 75% of the capability for 25% of the cost. This program had its own slightly different ethical problems. They still started with children, but they didn't kidnap them. Instead, they asked for volunteers from groups of war orphans, which after a decade of conflict with the Covenant there were far too many of. They offered these children an opportunity to get revenge against the Covenant, and hoped to use their anger as motivation for their training. That training was very similar to that of the previous program, but they were able to use the Spartan 2s as a model to follow, and were specifically taught many of the tactics and tricks that the 2s had developed themselves. The Spartan 3s also had a modified set of augmentations, and followed a much safer surgical schedule. This different augmentation process would result in, on average, lower effectiveness compared to the Spartan 2s, but that was more than made up for by the 0% failure rate. The big way that the Spartan 3 program was able to lower the cost of producing super soldiers was by harnessing economies of scale. They made a lot of them. 3 classes of approximately 300 Spartan 3s were trained. A small number of the best performing soldiers in each class were outfitted with Mjolnir armor and given special assignments, but the majority of Spartan 3s were given a newly designed and mass-produced version of powered armor. Less capable and less personalized, but significantly cheaper. But here comes the big question. If they made almost 1,000 Spartan 3s, how come we hear about them so much less than the 30 or so Spartan 2s? Well, that's because after a few missions to prove their combat effectiveness, the Spartan 3s would eventually be used on very high risk, very high reward missions. Suicide missions on Covenant targets that could only be performed by an entire company of super soldiers. True to the Spartan mythos, these missions had a 100% success rate, but also essentially a 100% casualty rate, with an extremely low number of survivors. So now that we know a little bit more about the home team, as it were, there's one last point I want to make about humanity in the Halo universe. They are losing the war, and it isn't even close. This should be apparent by the fact that the war has reached Earth, but it needs to be acknowledged. We've seen and heard how effective Spartan super soldiers are against the Covenant, and even regular human troops can hold their own in ground engagements, but they are undoubtedly outmatched in ship-to-ship combat. In general, 3 human ships will be destroyed in order to take out a single Covenant ship. These space engagements are almost always doomed fights, undertaken in order to buy time to evacuate colonies. Once the UNSC resistance is neutralized, the Covenant glass entire planets. If you're unclear on the use of glass as a verb, it means they bombard the planet with giant plasma cannons from orbit until the entire surface is destroyed. That is what the Covenant have done to hundreds of human colonies, and presumably what they intend to do to Earth. What we are seeing in the Master Chief's story really is humanity's last stand.